President Donald Trump says the success of the U.S. brokered ceasefire with Ukraine is now in the hands of Russia.
We've had a good relationship with both parties, actually, and we'll see. We'll be knowing people are going to Russia right now as we speak, and hopefully we can get a ceasefire from Russia. And if we do, I think that would be 80% of the way to getting this horrible bloodbath finished.
After more than 8 hours of negotiations yesterday, the U.S. and Ukraine agreed to the terms of a 30-day ceasefire deal, but those talks did not include Russia. Trump confirmed a U.S. team is on its way to Russia to discuss the terms. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the world eagerly awaits the Russian response.
Right now, we're just trying to get to the stage where there's actual diplomacy happening. Here's what we'd like the world to look like in a few days. Neither side is shooting at each other, not rockets, not missiles, not bullets, nothing, not artillery. The shooting stops, the fighting stops, and the talking starts. That's what we want to see. What happens during that talking and how that evolves, I think we're going to have to be flexible and nimble and creative and patient and work hard at it. That's how these things happen, and they're not easy, and sometimes they're difficult to predict which way they're going to go in terms of the specifics of it. But we just want to get to that stage. That would be, for lack of a better term, a good problem to have.
I'm joined now by Ukraine's Ambassador to Canada, Yuliya Kovaliv. Ambassador, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
President Zelensky has called this deal a positive step. What are you expecting to hear from Russia?
Actually, now the ball is on the Russian side. Indeed, there was a very productive discussion yesterday in Saudi Arabia with the U.S. delegation and Ukrainian delegation, and as a result, Ukraine accepted the proposal of from the United States to the 30-day of the ceasefire, which is now up to Russia. And I think it's now very clear that Ukraine wants peace. And by accepting also this proposal, we once again signal that we are very serious when we are saying that Ukraine wants peace. And this could be an important first step to the long and lasting peace. And that's now from Russia to demonstrate where they are, really.
What is your sense of whether Russia will come to the table on this, whether Russia will, because, you know, these talks happen in the absence of Russia, and I know it's not at that point yet, but what is your expectation from the Kremlin?
Well, probably here in a coming days. On the other side, like what we see, what's happening in Ukraine, that Russia continues. It's every day there are drone attacks, there are missile attacks. Just today, early in the morning, Ukraine's time, there was another Russian attack on a civilian building, just a hotel in Kryvyi Rih, the big industrial city in the eastern part of Ukraine. 9 people were injured. A week ago, there was another Russian attack to the same city, and there were, unfortunately, people who have died during this attack. So Russia continued to attack. And the proposal that we initially, and the president was putting the ceasefire in the air and in the sea, was expanded from U.S. side, and we accepted it, like 30 days of ceasefire on both sides. Ukraine is ready, and now it's for Russia.
A ceasefire is an important step, but a peace is a more difficult step to take. And Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, said today, part of the discussions include potential territorial concessions, which President Zelensky said is Ukraine's most important red line. How do you get to peace if the insistence is Russia gets to keep some of the land which Ukraine does not want to give up?
Look, I think we demonstrated in the discussions yesterday in Jeddah that there could be steps ahead. Yes, indeed. With the consequences of this war, and let's remember that this war started in 2014, so it's almost 11 years ago. And it started with occupation of Crimea, eastern regions, and then the full-scale invasion. And there are 2 pieces, even 3 important pieces. One is land, as you mentioned. Another important piece is the people, because we have thousands of civilians who are in Russian captivity. There are a lot of prisoners of war who have been tortured in Russia. There are over 19,000 of Ukrainian children illegally deported to Russia. there is also a huge file to work towards peace, which should definitely include this human file. And the third piece is also how for Ukraine, Ukrainians, and all Europe to feel secure
Right.
in a longer-term future. But we, as a country who wants peace more than anybody else, we're ready for these discussions. And I think it was over 7 hours of negotiations. We demonstrated a goodwill on that way. And now it's for Russia.
Yeah, I mean, joining Europe, joining NATO, having security guarantees, setting your own timelines for your elections, these are all still important goals for your government and for your people. I just wonder, I know you were in Kyiv, I believe, around the anniversary of the war when the Prime Minister last went there. What is your sense of these talks, this ceasefire, whether that's giving hope to Ukrainians? Because after the Oval Office meeting between the presidents, it seemed kind of dark. Where do you think the mood of your country is right now?
You know, frankly, people are tired, people are exhausted. It's constant attacks every day throughout all of the country. And it's 3 years in a row that people are living in these harsh circumstances. Children are going to school in the underground schools. And of course, this is hard. On the other side, Ukrainian soldiers on the front line are on the edge, continue to fight with a strong morale because they understand that they are protecting this our country, our freedom. And of course, Ukraine, as we stated, from back 2022, we were not the country who invaded another country. We are not the country who wants to continue this war, but we are the country who are protecting with all tools. We're at the front line, whether in the diplomatic front, protecting our country, protecting our people, and protecting our future. And that's why this third file of the post-war security for Ukraine is very important. And we really appreciate here both United States, Canada, and our European partners, because there are now a lot of talks among the European partners in a format which is called Coalition of Will, on the different modalities of what these guarantees can look like. And we're really grateful that Canada is a part of that discussion, that Canadian delegation that was headed by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in London on that discussions a week ago. More to be, more this discussion will be happening in European capitals, and really appreciate that Canada is on the table, at the table with these discussions.
Yeah, and I think Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, said today that he'd be hosting another meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, as it's called, on Saturday. So we'll see what comes out of that. But I just wonder, as a final point, a week and a half ago with the Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, it did not go well. The world was watching that. And intelligence sharing and military aid was all cut off. Now it's back on the table. There is movement towards this. How secure do you feel about the U.S. relationship right now? It seems unclear whether they're willing to be part of the post-war security guarantee. Certainly at this point, maybe it's more of a European thing. How would you assess the relationship with the White House at this moment?
I think, it was clearly seen yesterday by the meeting in Jeddah and the joint statement that was concluded, and some really good news for Ukraine and very important news for Ukraine, that the military support, U.S. military support to Ukraine was resumed, and intelligence sharing was also resumed. And it's an important step. And of course, there are a lot of steps ahead that that we will work with U.S. administration in terms on a way to long and lasting peace in Ukraine. And of course, our European partners, Canada, and the Coalition of Willing plays here an important role. And really, once again, I want to thank you, Canadian government, who is on the table together with the European colleagues, because it's important, because that's the group of courage and the group that shares the same values.
Yuliya Kovaliv, Ukraine's ambassador to Canada. We've spoken many times throughout this war. Hopefully we're speaking now towards the end of this war. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
After 3 years of war, the first potential step towards peace. 9 hours of talks yesterday between American, Ukrainian, and Saudi Arabian government officials resulted in Ukraine agreeing to a U.S. proposal for an interim 30-day ceasefire. And the Americans now say the ball is in Russia's court.
And we'll see what their response is. If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear.
Ian Bremmer is the founder and president of Eurasia Group, a political risk research and consulting firm. Ian Bremmer, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here, sir.
You too, man. Happy to be with you.
Let's talk about Ukraine and Russia off the top. I mean, Trump is expecting to speak with Russian President Putin in the next few days. Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, is going to be visiting Moscow this week. How do you see Trump and the U.S. administration, the role they would play in these peace talks moving forward?
Well, the fact is there is one, and there hasn't been for 3 years, so that's important. You have a 30-day ceasefire with no conditions, and the Ukrainians who were in the doghouse a week and a half ago and had their both military shipments and intelligence suspended from the U.S., that was clearly not a carrot, it was a very big stick. But now, not only have you restarted those things, but you also have the Ukrainians accepting that 30-day ceasefire. And that puts Putin in a somewhat uncomfortable position, right? Because he's very happy to engage with the United States over the heads of the Europeans, wants a rapprochement, wants the sanctions off, wants to engage, but doesn't really want to end the war right now, especially because Russia's still making gains, and he wanted any ceasefire discussion to be linked to the much broader context of NATO in the region, and Zelensky being out, and a whole bunch of things that he's not going to get to accept a 30-day ceasefire. So he has to figure out, does he want to be constructive with Trump on that, and maybe in response for some sanctions reduction, in order to keep the broader U.S.-Russia relationship conversation going, which is the prize for Putin. That's what he is trying to assess with the special envoy Witkoff coming to see them in the Kremlin in short order. And I kind of expect Putin's going to take that meeting personally, though we don't have that information yet. I certainly would if I were the Russian president.
It's interesting because when that Oval Office meeting with Zelensky went completely off the rails, right, it was very clear the message from the U.S. afterwards was, Ukraine's not ready for peace, come back when you are. And now they've got this, and so it flips the script a bit and puts the pressure on Russia. But to move even beyond a 30-day ceasefire, all of the pressure seems to have been put on the Ukrainians, at least publicly. I mean, what do you think it would take to get to a durable ceasefire and peace plan that could satisfy Ukraine, given what they've lost so far to this point?
Well, I mean, I just want to push back a bit, because I understand why it feels like all the pressure is on Ukraine. After all, for the last 3 years, Ukraine has been supported enormously by the United States and Europe. And that's not been the case for the last 50 plus days. It's been much more balanced and much more difficult for Zelensky and for the Europeans to swallow. But again, I want to point out the fact that Ukraine and the United States have now accepted a 30-day ceasefire and the Russians have not, and a ceasefire is better for Ukraine than it is for Russia right now, because the Russians they have momentum. They're gaining territory. They're the ones that don't want to stop the war. The Ukrainians have more to gain from getting a temporary ceasefire right now. So, just going into that conversation, the Russians have lost a negotiating point. But more broadly, it doesn't look like Ukraine is going to actually get significant security guarantees backstopped by the Americans. They're going to have to come from the Europeans. Aid is going to be harder to get from the United States. It's going to have to come from the Europeans. Now, the Europeans are showing that they're prepared to do a lot more, but a lot more isn't enough to keep the Ukrainians intact and safe long-term with a much bigger Russia. And so the difference between what happens in 30 days and what happens to get to an eventual long-term peace agreement, I guess I would argue that Russia still has an advantage in the way they can negotiate with the United States at that point. But they now have a pretty big hoop to jump through, and Putin hasn't shown himself really very willing to jump through hoops over the last 3 years. So we're going to have to, the next week is going to be extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, when I was speaking of pressure, I meant more the public belligerence, towards Zelensky versus the praise towards Putin. It's been almost, rhetorically, it's almost cast, the Ukrainians as the problem here, is the way it has kind of seemed, right? So I wonder.
Until yesterday.
Yes.
Until yesterday.
Fair.
That's the point. I'm just saying, but we know how fast things can change with this particular U.S. president. So I just don't want to underestimate the fact that recency doesn't mean it's not important.
I gotcha. So look, we haven't really heard anything as we're having this conversation very publicly and explicitly from Russia. The Ukrainians have agreed to the 30 days, and so now it is with Putin at the Kremlin. What do you expect to hear from them? What's your sense of whether they will go for this?
We've heard from some parliamentarians, and we've heard from a former Putin advisor, and they're all basically saying this deal isn't good for us. There's a lot more that we need to actually discuss with Trump. I think that I don't believe that Putin will accept 30 days by itself, no conditions. I think he wants at least a little wiggle room. He wants to hear attached to that Ukraine has no way into Ukraine, or he wants to see that the Americans are going to take some sanctions off of Russia, the Russian economy, unfreeze some of the assets of some oligarchs close to Putin. There needs to be a give or two. I don't think he will accept the deal as Ukraine has accepted it, because Putin has a lot more leverage than Ukraine does. And you even heard Trump kind of, sort of talk around that when he says that Zelensky doesn't have any cards. And then he says, Russia, they think they have cards, but they don't really have many cards either. He didn't say any. He said many. And so again, from Trump's perspective, he understands that the Russians have a bit of leverage here. They don't have America-style leverage, but they have a bit of leverage, and that the United States only has so much more they can do to Russia. Trump has said he would put tougher sanctions on Russia if they refuse to accept a ceasefire, if they're the ones to blame. But the reality is that any further U.S. sanctions that would really hurt Russia would probably have to go against Russian oil export to India, to China, which would cause a much bigger problem for the global market and frankly for the United States, which is why the Biden administration was so unwilling to do that. So I think that if you're Putin, you recognize that you're in a stronger position than Ukraine. You don't want to undermine the relationship with Trump, so you want to still have that bilateral, broader conversation. Lord knows you don't want the Europeans getting in. So you probably want to accept the 30 days, but you want to see what you can get for it. And so I don't think it's going to be announced in the next day or two. I think it will take a bit. And I think that Putin and Trump are probably going to have to work it out individually. If it doesn't, the danger is that the broader conversation between the U.S. and Russia, Trump loses interest. And that suddenly the Europeans start taking the lead in what is going to be a much more challenging peace arrangement to work out, and one where the Ukrainians end up having a bigger seat at the table than they have right now.
Just one more question I want to squeeze in before we let you go, Ian Bremmer. Is that, I think it was your 2024 geopolitical risk analysis. You listed domestic U.S. politics as the #1 geopolitical risk. And here we are. We're in a trade war. Canada was standing around minding its own business, and boom, here we are. And now actions against the European Union, threats of trying to take back wealth, take back companies, and just a realignment of sort of the North Atlantic Alliance seems to be kind of happening. I mean, what's your sense of what allies and the world can expect under 4 years of Trump?
Trump was very transactional in his first presidency. He was much more insecure. He needed the Republican Party more than they needed him. This time around, he is the Republican Party. They are all loyal to him. Some of his advisors are very good. Some of them are completely incompetent. Doesn't matter. They're fully loyal, and they won't give him information that he doesn't want to hear. So, and that's a dangerous position for an ally to be in, right? When, you're having a sensible conversation with some advisor, but when they're in a room with Trump, they're not going to say that because they know that Trump will be upset about it. So his willingness to do a lot of damage to the markets, to the trade relationship, to the alliance, and not necessarily get effective pushback internally is so much higher this time around. And that doesn't mean that he won't pay any attention to markets and he cares about his own personal rating, but he's not running for re-election. And he was shot in the head and almost killed a few months ago, and that had an impact on him. I mean, he feels a level of urgency. So I fear in this electoral cycle that the Canadians are going through, that the United States is going to be willing to punch much harder and repeatedly than you experienced in the first term. And it's going to be more challenging for the Canadians to get to a deal and also to eventually agree on what USMCA in 2026 looks like going forward.
Well, on that happy note, Ian Bremmer, we'll leave it there. Always appreciate your time, sir. Thanks for being here.
Sure.